Hello everybody, this is a Chivalry 2 weapons tier list video on the most recent update 2.8 raiding party. It's going to include all the new nifty buffs and nerfs as well as the new weapon, the Heavy Cavalry Sword, and it's going to be based on my unique parameters that I would like to believe are kind of distinct from the other Chivalry 2 channels in that this is a competitive tier list, made for competitive play, and you can still apply that to your gameplay, but it's just clear that this tier list is based on what you can do with this weapon at its maximum potential. Because ideally, that's where you're trying to get to, right? You're not trying to find out how good a weapon is against a nooblet. Regardless, we're going to hop right in. So, the tier list parameters. Two things that are important. One, this is based on team objective and last team standing, not duels. It's based on the competitive variants of those game modes. What does that mean? Well, basically, try and imagine that you're in a lobby full of triple-digit levels, all try-harding. What weapons will work against them in this theoretical lobby? That's what this tier list is for. Then the second aspect of this list is the subclass context. Subclass context basically means these weapons will be taking their subclass context into account. What that means is some of these weapons are used in certain situations that adhere to the advantages or disadvantages of their subclass, and so it's important to understand that. For example, daggers will always be paired with throwing knives because they're an ambusher weapon. The Heavy Mace will always be paired with officer because it's an officer weapon. And some weapons have a ton of different ways to utilize them because they're on multiple subclasses. So all of that's going to be taken into account when rating these weapons. Anyway, moving on. Let me explain the tiers and what they mean. S obviously means that it is the best kind of weapon. They are superior to all the other weapons, and they will provide a considerable advantage. And then we have A, B, and C, which is pretty much just all kind of blurred together, but all of these weapons are still viable. I believe that anything C tier and above is completely viable, meaning that you can top frag with it if you're skilled enough. Then we have the actually bad tier. The actually bad tier basically refers to a weapon that is actually bad, meaning that it's either going to be considerably difficult, if not impossible, to top frag in these lobbies, and it's just overall not really good at whatever it tries to fulfill. And then we have the redundant tier, which is a little bit more complex, but it essentially means that although the weapon may be A, B, C, whatever it is redundant in that there is already a weapon like it that is better or just slightly better that plays similarly. And obviously, this is all subjective, but tier lists in general are very subjective, so I don't really have an issue with that. If you're curious, this list is not just based on my opinion. I also gathered at like 3 or 4 extremely good competitive players, and I implemented their opinions as well, and I let them argue a little bit in a Discord call as to where things should be positioned. And at the end, they all, I'm not going to say they fully agreed with the list, but at least they all were like, yep, this list is pretty representative of what I think is current Chivalry 2. So anyway, we're good to go. Let's begin. Starting off with the first weapon in the actually bad tier, we have, where are you? The throwing axes. The throwing axes is a primary for skirmisher, and skirmisher is by far the worst subclass for chivalry competitive, or honestly, chivalry against any good players. Furthermore, they are just a worse option than the javelins, only getting 1 more ammo for a projectile that is considerably less damaging, and also is just a worse melee weapon in general. Obviously, they're half decent as throwables, but they are just throwables, and even then, they're worse than the throwing knives because you can't use them while holding an actual primary weapon. They have hit stop on their attacks, they do extremely low damage. Overall, these things just suck. The range is pitiful. I have nothing good to say about these. Although you can pair them up with the light shield or small shield, whatever it's called, is kind of just pathetic. It breaks way too quickly for the extra 10 jab damage that you get from it, and obviously you have to use it on archers, so this thing just sucks. Next, we have the Katar. The Katar are now what I consider not the worst weapon, but the second worst. With the new leaping strike added to it, as well as the stamina drain reduced, this weapon, although dog water, is still better than the throwing axes, and honestly it's kind of a debate which one is better or worse, but hey, you know, at least it's to the point where now it's a discussion rather than just straight up being worse. These Katars are pretty good at getting some really quick backstab damage if you get behind, and obviously their animations are a little wonky, incredibly fast attacks. While I don't think that these are good at all, especially for team play, at least they have been improved to the point where I can say they're not the worst weapon in the game. Now they're the second worst weapon in the game. Progress. Moving on, javelins. Javelins suck against good players. Good players will simply just see them and then they will block. And that's pretty annoying when playing a skirmisher with only 5 rounds. If you didn't know, the javelins actually do less damage than the warbow. That's pretty sad, considering that a warbow shot will one-shot an archer to the body, but a javelin will not. That's kind of pathetic. So, and obviously a warbow has much more ammo, is much easier to use, has much more range, etc., can't be blocked. So these things just suck. The only saving grace of them is that they have the one-handed spear special, which allows them to be somewhat useful as a melee attack, especially since that special is faster on the javelins. And in general, their moveset is actually that of a weapon, and they pair very well with the small shield. So I have to say that they can actually fight back, which is something that the Katars and the throwing axes cannot really do. Next, the knife. The knife is very bad, but I have to say that doesn't mean it needs a buff. The knife is purposefully bad because it is meant to be a bad secondary. That's its utility. But it is better than the rest here because it has a very unique utility in that you can pull it out extremely quickly. So when you're using like an archer or another class, while this may not be a good option compared to something like, you know, the axe or the hatchet or the short sword, because you can pull it out quicker, that gives you a reason to use it. It is not totally useless. Also, because of its unique, extremely quick hit-stop combos, it actually can attack faster than the enemy can jab you, which is extremely useful in a duel. But obviously, the damage and range deficit is extremely apparent, and that makes it not very viable. Lastly, in the actually bad tier, we have the cudgel. The cudgel is mainly seen as a worse version of the hatchet because it has hit stop and does less damage and feels like it doesn't have that much more range. No one is very fond of the cudgel. There's not a lot of cudgel players. It does have kind of a decent special because it has the mace special, but the range makes it not as useful. Overall, this weapon's pretty sucky. You're either using it on footman or vanguard, and either way, it just feels awful. I really have not much to say, but obviously, because it's just a normal weapon that can be used normally, unlike these other abominations, it's got to be somewhat decent. So it is the best bad weapon in the game. Moving on, we are going to skip the redundant tier, and we're going to add things to it as we add their not redundant counterparts. It'll make more sense once we get to it, but obviously, you know, you'll see when we get there. Now, the worst weapon in Chivalry 2 that I would consider good is the dagger. The dagger is a very interesting weapon because it does insane stab damage and obviously has a very, very unique special that just does crazy damage. You can one-shot a footman to the back in tandem with its 50% increased backstab, as well as the fact that it cannot down people because it benefits from the murderer passive, or whatever it's called, executioner. It's called something that allows you to not down people. On top of the fact that it is paired with throwing knives for that ranged damage, and those throwing knives have increased damage to heads. Overall, this weapon makes up for its range by its bad range by having those throwing knives make up for that. And that creates a very interesting gameplay, which I think is good. It also is reasonably fast, and I like the moveset on it, but it is held back, unfortunately, by its overheads and swings, doing pitiful damage and having hit stop, even on the heavies. So that makes it extremely bad in team fights, and because this is a team-based game, that puts you at a disadvantage compared to everything else. So, gotta say, worst good weapon in the game. Next is the hatchet. Where are you? Boom. The hatchet, basically an alternative to the dagger, has a lot less stab damage, has a lot more overhead and swing damage, and it has a damage bonus. This little peepsqueak of a weapon is very interesting. I like it a lot. While it does have less range than the dagger, it can two-shot knights, and it's quite fast. So I like it a lot. It's my go-to weapon on Ambusher. The moveset is a lot more normal than the dagger, and while it is just a worse version of the axe, it is very interesting in the ways that you can use it. Obviously, with it being on Ambusher, you can use throwing knives with it, and I like that a lot. So I gotta say, it's just slightly better than the dagger, and it is an option. Moving on, the short sword. The short sword is better than both of these because it simply just has more range and similar damage. You could consider it the actual alternative to the dagger, having more slash and overhead damage and less stab damage, while also having more speed and more range. Because of that greater speed and greater range, it's considered an actual well-rounded secondary, which you can utilize. But because it doesn't two-shot knights, I don't like it that much. Although, because of that increased speed and range, it is just much better at doing everything and keeping yourself alive, especially because it can be used on Guardian, and it's very good on Guardian as a secondary. Most Guardians like to run Warhammer, and so this weapon pairs well as a secondary for killing Vanguards instead of the Warhammer. So overall, I think it has a lot more utility. It's very, very good, and it's most people's go-to ambusher weapon. Next, the Glaive. The Glaive is very odd. I would consider it the worst two-handed weapon in the game, mainly because the damage is just pitiful. It's a very weird story where this is the second longest polearm in the game, if you count the spear, the longest polearm if you don't. And also, it's quite fast. I think it's the fastest polearm in the game as well, but unfortunately, the damage is just so pitiful that you can't really utilize those benefits. While this has a very interesting playstyle where you could spam overheads at a really far distance, it's overall just pitiful on polemen because that sprint charge is terrible. And maybe not terrible, but it's the worst polearm sprint charge. And on Vanguard, you just have better options. I don't feel the need to use a Glaive on Vanguard when I could use a Messer or a Danax or a two-handed hammer. So this weapon just really doesn't have that much of a place, but it is still usable. I've still seen people do 200 takedown games with this weapon. Further on, the Falchion. We're getting to an actual one-handed weapon here instead of the PP one-handed weapons. The Falchion is very interesting. It has those slow-ish attacks. Not too good range, but good enough. And it has great damage. This weapon has amazing damage. I think the special does crazy amounts of damage. And it can be paired well on either Guardian or Man-at-Arms. I love it a lot. Overall, decent weapon. A lot of people like to even use it on Crusader, I think, because there's no sword on Crusader. A lot of people consider the sword better than this weapon, and obviously I do as well, which is why the sword is above on this list. But this is not just a significantly worse weapon than the sword. It has its utilities, and I think those utilities are pretty good. Those better drags and increased damage really allow it to shine in a way that the sword can't sometimes. So I say decent weapon. Further up, the Axe. Slightly shorter than the Falchion, but doing more damage. I love this weapon. It has some very good animations. It has a much better special than the Falchion. It is a little shorter, but, you know, just like me, a little shorter, the chicks still love it. I think that the speed is a little bit better than the Falchion. Not really too sure, but it feels faster. The overhead animation is definitely favorable. I like this weapon a lot more, especially because it can be a sidearm on Officer. Overall, very decent pick, and I like it a lot. So I don't really have much to say. Again, all these weapons sometimes are very similar. They kind of blur together, but it's a great option, and so it just has to go there. Although, because of the damage and the extra stamina damage bonus, I gotta say the Axe is slightly better. Next, we have the Rapier. Some may feel like the Rapier is rated a little bit too low, but I feel this is just right. Unfortunately, if I were to compare the Rapier to other weapons, I would say that it has very unique strengths, and even, especially in 1v1s, the Rapier would be a lot higher. But at the moment, I don't think this weapon can perform well compared to the higher weapons on the tier list, and so obviously it has to go below them. The slashes and overheads, while extremely useful in 1vx's because of their hit stop and increased speed, do extremely low damage, and I think that holds it back in normal play. Although you can make them heavy and make them go through, which makes them do okay-ish damage. The stabs obviously are incredibly fast and high damaging, and so this weapon has its uses and obviously is very unique. I also think that its special is very good, even though it is a little weird to use. Once you get used to it, it can be a very powerful tool, as well as its stabs, which come at a very steep angle rather than a straight line, which makes it great for getting around parries, and I absolutely love that aspect about it. It's probably my favorite part about the weapon, and what keeps it actually viable. Further on, the Heavy Cavalry Sword. So, the Heavy Cavalry Sword is kind of in a tough spot for me. A lot of you may be disappointed that it is a low in the C tier, but that's just how I feel the weapon is. I've really given a lot of thought to this weapon. I promise. I've been using it almost nonstop since the update, and it is one of my favorite weapons right now. It's in my top 5 for weapons. It's just not that good. The damage is low and the speed is abysmal. A lot of people will like the fact that it doesn't have a lot of speed, like me, because it means that the drags are just so much better. But unfortunately, that comes at the cost of its performance in a team-based setting. The range does make up for it, don't get me wrong. If I were to consider this weapon, I would say it's like an alternative to the falchion. These weapons are not separated by a big gap, to be honest with you. It might look like it on the tier list, but they're not. The range on this thing is crazy and the stab drags are very nice, but unfortunately the damage, you really feel it when trying to fight something like knights, and unfortunately knights are the most popular class, you know? So I really have to consider all that when looking at this weapon and seeing how it performs, and I don't think that it performs considerably well. Now we should talk about the other aspect of it, which is its horse performance. Its horse performance is amazing. I know not a lot of people care about horses, but unfortunately the heavy cavalry sword is meant to be used on cavalry. And the cavalry aspect of the weapon is very nice. It increases in damage by a lot, and it increases in speed by a lot. And it gains these unique animations, and obviously the special becomes extremely powerful and easy to use on horseback. And all of that is nice, but the unfortunate reality is that even on horseback, the options that were already better are still better. Like, sorry, the options that were already amazing are still better than the heavy cavalry sword. The heavy cavalry sword is not better than the halberd on horseback, and it's not better than the spear or a greatsword on horseback. It is just another option that is good. I mean, it's definitely the best one-handed weapon on horseback, that's for sure, by a considerable margin, but it is not the best weapon on horseback. And so it kind of is redundant in that regard. It's not going to be in the redundant tier because obviously it has other aspects to it, and it does not play the same as those weapons on horseback, but it's important to understand that the heavy cavalry sword is not the best cavalry part. Sorry, it's not the best cavalry weapon, and so the cavalry part of it is not going to be taken into account in this tier list. So it's not going to be put in A because it's so good on cavalry. It's going to be put in C because that's where it stands as a weapon outside of cavalry. So there you go. Next, the mace. The mace and Morningstar are probably what I consider the best one-handed weapons that I can think of. Two-shot knights have incredible speed, have decent range, do great stamina damage, have a very easy-to-use, awesome special attack, which I really think keeps them above the cut, and can be used on the Guardian, Crusader, and Man-at-Arms. And also Officer for the mace. So I really like these weapons a lot, especially me. Morningstar is my favorite weapon. So I may be a little biased in calling it one of the best one-handed weapons, but obviously others agree with me. They are extremely oppressive in a duel setting, and their just overall stamina damage is crazy. It's not as crazy as the heavy mace, but it's basically equal. So I have to say that these weapons are just solid. There's really not much else to say. The drags on them are pretty decent. The range is pretty decent. They're two-shot knights. They're fast. They have an amazing special, all-around great weapons. But unfortunately, even though they're great weapons, there are greater weapons, which is why they're in C tier. Next, the sword. I actually believe that the mace and Morningstar are slightly better than the sword, but the sword has utility that these weapons do not. On something like Officer, the sword is a great secondary just to trip people up because of its increased speed and range over the Mace and Morningstar. So while the Mace and Morningstar may be better primaries, I believe that the sword is actually a better secondary, which is why I'm putting it above here, because the utility is better on something like Officer. I really believe that it's the best secondary to have when you pair it up with throwing knives on Officer, and it's just a great complement when you have something like the Heavy Mace or the Great Sword. And I think that all around, it's just so good at just fighting and staying alive and getting those quick hits in. When the Mace and Morningstar obviously are going to be a little bit slower, a little bit shorter, not do as much damage to vanguards, and they work better as the main thing that you're using rather than the secondary thing that you're using. Okay, so we finished C tier and we're going to enter B tier. The first weapon we're going to put in B tier is the Warbow. The Warbow is obviously different from all the rest of these weapons because it's an archer weapon. And primarily, I'm going to put it in B tier because I do think that it has value in that you can target specific players with this. So you can obviously target their hard hitters, but also it can do amazing damage to archers, one-shotting them to the body with a fully charged shot, and also it just does a crazy amount of base damage to anyone with those 90 damage attacks. Not attacks, but arrows. And all around, I think that really keeps it super, super valuable. I don't think that it's above the best weapons in the game, but I think that a really good archer with warbow is more valuable than a really good man-at-arms or a really good ambusher. So that's why that's above. Right above that, however, though, is the crossbow. I believe that the crossbow is slightly better because, one, I think the kill potential is just faster. Maybe it wouldn't be faster if less people played Knight, but the unfortunate reality is that most people play Knight, and obviously the crossbow has a damage bonus. There's also a lot of polemen in competitive play and good players because they like to use the best weapons in the game, and the best weapons in the game are on polemen. So the crossbow somehow ends up doing more damage than the warbow. It actually has a faster fire rate on top of doing more damage, and although it doesn't do more damage per hit, it ends up kind of accumulating a better damage per minute because of how that works. And on top of that, you get a banner for landing headshots rather than a brazier, which helps your team so much more. The infinite banner glitch, as they call it, is amazing because if you land like 2 or 3 headshots a minute, you're getting banners like that, constantly. So those banners really help your team. Keeps the crossbow slightly above the warbow for me. Although I should say that in a competitive setting, the best team comps would not have 2 warbows or 2 crossbows. They would have a crossbow and a warbow to complement each other because the crossbow is obviously worse at killing other archers because it can't one-shot them in the body. Very good balance there. Next, we are going to move on to the pickaxe. While this isn't necessarily the best weapon, it's a very good one-handed weapon, but it also damages the objectives twice as fast because it does double damage to them. And field engineers are kind of necessary in competitive play, so this just has a lot of value, mainly because it can break objectives faster, and also it can break enemy walls faster. And enemy walls are all over the place on different team objective maps. So I gotta say, this has crazy value, should not be underestimated. And even if you're not playing in team objective, the damage of it is kind of just insane. It's just a really good one-handed weapon with good animations. Now, we reveal the Maul. The Maul is a token weapon from all medieval slashers, and it has always been considered the GOAT in almost all those slashers. In Chivalry 2, it was kind of bad for a long while, but after it got its stamina buffed and it was saved from that nerf that Jen tried to do, we'll never forgive her for that, it is now pretty decent. I gotta say, the damage on this thing is incredible. The stamina damage on this thing is incredible. Running into crowds, heavy attacking multiple people at once is extremely satisfying with this weapon. It does its job. There's not much else to say. It's just a really slow, awesome hammer. Speaking of hammers, the two-handed hammer. This weapon to me is slightly better than the Maul, mainly because it can be paired up with a different type of weapon. So I could have the two-handed hammer and then I could have the messer. But also because it's just a little faster and can still two-shot knights just as the Maul can. So there's not a lot of utility in that. It's also just more versatile. I think it has slightly better animations. And I think it's just more usable in general. It also can be used on knight as well for an alternative playstyle, but we'll get into reasons why you wouldn't want to do that later. Coming up to my favorite axe, the battle axe. The battle axe by many is considered to be a bad weapon in team play because of how short it is, but it does amazing damage and amazing stamina damage, so I gotta say, I still like it. Those overheads hit like a truck, and I think that it's very valuable. Now, why is it above the other weapons behind it if those are longer and faster and do similar damage? Well, to me, this weapon does a lot more stamina damage because it has just such a high base damage, which makes it really good against all classes that are blocking in crowds. It also does great damage against vanguards, and I just think that this weapon is really good, as well as the fact that you can pair it up on knight or vanguard. So that's really a plus. We make our way to the second worst polearm, the pole hammer. Now, the pole hammer is a sad story. I almost put it in the redundant tier, but obviously it does play different than the halberd. The idea with the pole hammer is that it's slightly faster than the halberd, but does slightly less damage. Unfortunately, this leads to it kind of having very little place. It has less damage than the halberd. Even on knights, the hit to kill is the same. The range is shorter, and you can't really utilize those faster attacks because they have hit stops. So you can't even like swing through crowds like crazy. and it ends up with it not having that much use. It used to have these very weird attacks, which many people refer to as handle hits, where the attack would come out incredibly quickly because you're hitting them with the handle of the weapon rather than the actual edge. But they've recently patched those slightly and nerfed them to where that's not really as viable or possible to do. And so obviously the attacks come out slower in a dual setting or a setting where you're trying to manipulate your attacks very close to them. And because of that, it's a lot less viable. So I have to say, the polehammer has very little reason to be picked right now, but it is still a polearm, and it does still have that crazy range and those crazy heavy attacks in crowds, so it obviously still is extremely valuable in a team fight if you can use it properly. Next, the Highland Sword. I almost put the Highland Sword in the redundant tier, but I didn't. Why? Well, I think that the Highland Sword is very interesting because it is just super, super slow. But this does come with some advantages. The increased counter window, I also forgot to mention that with the Heavy Cavalry Sword, the increased counter window makes it a lot better, obviously, than it would be because of its speed. And also just the increased active parry window. It gives this weapon a purpose, even if it's not that great of one. It also has these extremely high damage heavy overheads. The 100 damage heavy overhead on the Highland Sword allows it to one-shot an overhealed archer. And sometimes archers have overheal a lot of the time because they don't die often. So, you know, that does have a purpose to exist. Regardless, I don't really like it, but it is not a bad weapon by any means. I forgot to go over some of the redundant weapons, so we're going to do that now. We have the shovel, the bow, and what else? The sledgehammer. So why are these weapons in redundant? Well, the bow is basically just a worse version of the warbow. It's a stepping stone to unlock the warbow. This weapon does not one-shot archers to the body. It does not do a considerable amount of damage, and it does not have many benefits to pick over the warbow. They recently gave it a point buff to make you feel better about how pathetic it is, but it still is somewhat pathetic. It's not that you can't do anything with this weapon, it's that it doesn't really have a reason to exist. The theoretical reason would be that if you can hit more shots, you're getting more profit because it has a faster fire rate. But the problem is that the damage is like half of the warbow. So it doesn't really shoot that much faster to make it worth it. And so I consider this redundant because the playstyle is very similar, but the profit is the same. The profit is much more different because you get much more with this. And for the sledgehammer and the shovel, both of these weapons just do the same thing that the pickaxe does, but they're just worse weapons. So I don't see why you would pick them. Without having a secondary and without having a shield or anything, you're just going to want the best weapon possible, and so the pickaxe is just better than these two in every way. The sledgehammer does slightly more damage to constructibles because it has slightly more damage, but not enough to matter, and then you just have a much worse weapon in general. If I were to take one of these out of redundant, it would definitely be this one, but I really don't see a reason to, and because I would never pick them. So because of that, pickaxe. The last weapon that we will put in B tier, which is the best B tier weapon, is the Warhammer. The Warhammer, in my opinion, is the greatest one-handed weapon in the game, besides the one-handed spear, but we're also going to get into that, why that matters as well. It does insane amounts of damage, insane amounts of stamina damage, is paired with the heavy shield, which makes you an absolute tank, and gets you banners when you use it. This thing is awesome. It is very interesting. The special attack is extremely slow, but does so much damage. It's insane. It basically is like a Maul special, except slightly worse, but obviously much easier to land because it has the mace special animation. This is a great weapon that should be feared. Those accelerated overheads are also quite scary, so I definitely think that this weapon deserves to be the best B tier weapon. Further on, the Executioner Axe. This is the worst A tier weapon to me. It has great drags, great range, and decent damage. I don't really have a lot to say on this. Obviously, I've seen it in action, and there are some amazing players that use this, and it works very well for them, but I believe that the other axes are better slightly. Obviously, better than the Battle Axe, but that's because just the increased range and the better drags. I really think that it's a very good weapon. I don't really have much to say. I don't use it much, but obviously, you know, put it in A tier, so it's slightly better than everything else that we've mentioned so far. The War Club. The War Club is very interesting, and it's an extremely fast weapon that can be used by the Devastator in very interesting ways. I like it a lot, especially as an LTS weapon. I see some very good players use it in very good ways. And I don't think it would be this high up here without those good players showing me how good it could be. But after I've played around with it a little bit more and tried using it in duels as well as LTS, I've seen that its value is very apparent. It can still two-shot knights despite its crazy fast speed. It has great range. It pairs up with the infinite stamina pool of the Devastator very well. I gotta say, this weapon is one to keep an eye on, and you should give it a chance if you have not already. It can seem like just a worse version of the two-handed hammer, but it is not. I actually believe that it is better considerably. Now, one of the dreaded stamina drain negation weapons, the Poleaxe. The Poleaxe now has 10% stamina drain negation instead of 20%, and obviously that means it is slightly worse. It still has decent attacks, a very wonky overhead, an amazing special attack, probably the best special attack in the game, if I'm being honest, and great overheads, good stabs, which people underrate the stab on it a lot, but I don't. The heavy stab is amazing. Overall, like this weapon a lot. I would say it's my favorite axe in the game. See, I tricked you. It's not the battle axe, it's the Poleaxe. Get screwed. Anyway, A tier weapon, still, even with that nerf, because increased stamina drain negation is just amazing. So it instantly makes it better than what I would consider alternatives to it that aren't even better, that are just, let's say, equally, powerful. Now, the longsword, also a staple of the slasher genre, just like the Maul. The longsword has been in every game, and it's been good. Chivalry 2 has a unique longsword where it's a stab-focused weapon, more so than a slash or overhead-focused weapon. Kind of like real-life history, and obviously it is amazing. The stabs are powerful, the attacks are extremely fast, it can be used on Officer and paired with throwing knives, charges up that Warhorn very well. I love this weapon. It's really, really good. It's probably one of my favorite two-handed weapons, and I love the fast attacks. The special is actually very unique. It has a completely unique special that isn't on any other weapon, and I love it a lot, where you kind of half-sword it and slam down. It's really cool. Very nice. Don't really have much to say besides that, but the heavy stabs are very awesome. It's kind of like a two-handed rapier sometimes. Moving on, the one-handed spear. Now, the one-handed spear is a spear, and so it is extremely powerful. Unfortunately, we don't get to see it a lot in competitive play because of spear limitations, but it is an extremely powerful weapon. I believe that spamming its special attack from afar to constantly reset the enemy and push them back is very good. The heavy stabs doing insane damage. They can be dragged quite well. The knockback on the spears was reduced slightly, but I don't really notice it too much. I love this weapon. Although it can only stab and the overheads are kind of bad, it is still viable. I think that this is one of the better weapons, and it actually is pretty good in a duel, where I consider the spear not too good in a duel. So its ability to be used on Guardian and Man-at-Arms is quite awesome. Next, the War Axe. Many consider the War Axe to be a noob stomper, which it is. The insane damage, good range, great animations, and ability to be used on Officer make it a weapon to be feared. This weapon, although I don't love it, is very good, and many consider it to be the best axe, at least for team objective. It's obviously a little bit more closer with LTS, but the margin is a little bit wider with team objective. This weapon is awesome. It really has no weaknesses. The stab is obviously not that good, but most axes stabs are not that good, so it's not really a big deal, and it compares quite well to the other axes. The last weapon in A tier, the Daneaxe. The Daneaxe is amazing. I actually believe that the War Axe is slightly better than the Daneaxe as a weapon, but this involves the Raider with a rocket launcher strategy, which is basically where a Raider takes a Daneaxe and only uses it for throwing it at people, which deals 100 damage sometimes. Daneaxe is one of the best weapons to throw. It throws incredibly quickly, incredibly far, and there really is nothing else to say. Some Raiders play LTS with 2 Daneaxes, and all they do is just throw them. Like, that's insane. The idea of taking 2 weapons and then just throwing them and then using your knife as a main strategy. But it works because Daneaxe's throws are just amazing. So that's why this is an A tier. It's extremely useful and extremely viable. Moving on to S tier. The worst S tier weapon, in my opinion, is the Heavy Mace. The Heavy Mace was recently nerfed a little bit to where it has 10% stamina drain negation instead of 20%, just like the Poleaxe. But unfortunately, it is still amazing. It is still like a very good weapon. And I say unfortunately because I don't like fighting it too much. But obviously, that's okay. It's an amazing weapon. It is basically a better version of the two-handed hammer because it has a faster wind up, but then a slower release. And what that means is it actually has better accelerations and better drags. Usually those are not hand in hand. Most weapons, if they have better drags, they have worse accels. And if they have, better accels, they have worse drags, because that's just how wind up and release works. But with the Heavy Mace, it just defies all logic and physics. Don't know how. I was considering putting the two-handed hammer in redundant tier because of this, but because the two-handed hammer can be used on Vanguard, it technically has a use. But what I will put in redundant now is the quarterstaff. So, why is the quarterstaff in redundant tier? Well, the quarterstaff was known as a stamina drain negation-based weapon, having much better stamina management than the Heavy Mace. But at the moment, the Heavy Mace kind of just has better attacks and the same stamina drain negation on block. So there's not really a reason to use the quarterstaff anymore. This weapon kind of doesn't deserve to exist. You all know me, I want it on Man-at-Arms. That way it actually is like very unique with the playstyle on Man-at-Arms. But at the moment, since this is on Knight and this is on Knight, I don't really see a reason to use the quarterstaff. And so the new nerfs to both weapons have made the quarterstaff redundant, and this not redundant. Next, the tried and true Messer. Messer has no weaknesses. It has great overheads, great stabs, great swings, awesome speed, good damage, a great special attack that has a unique animation. Overall, I have nothing to say on this weapon. It can be used on Raider or it can be used on Crusader. Either way, it is an amazing weapon. It changes the playstyle slightly with either, but both use it to great effect. I have nothing to say. Messer is standard. Messer is amazing. Further on, the Greatsword. The Greatsword is very interesting, being a much larger version of other swords. It has extremely great drags, great damage, same special as the Messer, but still unique. I like it a lot. I think that it should not have been added to Officer. It's mainly a Devastator weapon, but it plays very well on Devastator, making it one of the best subclasses in the game because of its ability to use Greatsword. Those swings and overheads are amazing. The stab, obviously, is not as good as the Messer stab, but it still does the trick sometimes, especially with the mix-ups. And Excel overhead riposts with the Greatsword are genuinely scary. So I got to put it on S tier. It's one of the best weapons in the game. Now, I'm going to rate these two last weapons kind of interchangeably, but the halberd and the spear are basically the best weapons in the game. Now, Pullman obviously is a very interesting case because the footman class is widely agreed upon to be not a good class, but the fact that it can use these pole arms means that it's better because those pole arms are OP. So halberd is an all-around amazing weapon, being able to two-shot every class in the game with either the stabs or overheads, and the spear is what I consider the best weapon in the game because those stabs are amazing. It has the most range, sprint charge is the longest range, and those heavy stabs are good in both TO and LTS. The halberd as well has amazing stabs, and some people consider it better than the spear. I do not, but they are so close that you can interchange them, and I would not mind. The halberd is an amazing weapon, and obviously it's a more well-rounded weapon because of its ability to use slashes and overheads properly, while the spear is basically just a stab, stab, stab. But that stab, stab, stab is so potent that I can't ignore it. It has to be a little bit better. I'm sorry. But that's just my opinion. Regardless, this is the entire tier list. Hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, please go below in the comment section, and I'll be answering them. If you disagree with anything on this list, also let me know. I'll be making another tier list the next update, but for the time being, sit back and have fun with Raiding Party.